You know both buttons, right? On for the mic and on for the camera. So we're live. What's that? Thank you so much. We are back on Wednesday night, and folks will be gathering. We have some on time, and some they're like, you know, tomorrow morning I'm teaching with a Baptist group in India over Zoom, and Tony Cupid arranged this, and he said the real problem is that these Indian pastors, you can say when you're going to start, but they trickle in over the 10 minutes after you schedule the time. And I said, I had no idea our church was Indian. That was just a new lesson for me to learn that McLean Baptist was actually Indian, because that's what happens. It doesn't matter when we say we're going to start, you know, it's 10 after before everybody finally gets there. But anyway, I had originally said we might finish tonight, but then I realized there was more than I thought. So we might finish tonight. We'll see how it goes. We might get through the end of it. Then again, I'm not under a rush. It's not a semester. I don't have to give tests. We're not doing a syllabus. We can take this slow if we want to, or we can go fast. Either way. So it's pass-fail. That's right. Everything's pass-fail. I'm doing life pass-fail right now, so I think that's the way to do it. So anything we need to think about before we get going? Okay. Nancy.
One more time, because it was based on the questions I asked you last week.
Okay, one more time.
The reason for the way the history was read by different apostles,
the gospel writers.
Yes, the example you gave was
the temptations.
No, the temple.
Oh, the temple cleansing. Yes.
One of them where Jesus.
Yes.
Walked out.
We'll see one of them tonight. Yeah. Right.
Why that sort of discrepancy is something that
didn't bother them but bothers you?
Because I don't know how when somebody says, look at
right,
the differences.
Right.
And what do you,
so after the Bible study last week, Nancy asked a great question that she was afraid to ask on camera. And I encouraged her to ask it on camera because it's a great question. And it was basically how to navigate when you have the stories that are told in the Gospels that are told in different ways. And I mean, the classic example is the temptations between Luke and Matthew are in a different order. They both have the same first temptations, but they invert the last two. And another example is Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have the temple cleansing at the end of Jesus' ministry. In fact, as we saw in Mark, that seemed to really precipitate the people wanting to kill Jesus. I mean, that's when the leadership really got upset, is when he had cleansed the temple. And then in John, that story's at the beginning of the ministry. And so why does John move it back? And go ahead.
But the other part of the argument being either that the people who wrote these
correct
either say that they witnessed this, or they spoke with other people who witnessed it.
They never claim to be eyewitnesses except John, who says we were eyewitnesses to his glory. And Luke acknowledges he wasn't a witness. He researched sources. So he said, many have undertaken to write, but I've decided to write an orderly account. Right. And so Mark makes no claim for apostleship or eyewitnesship. Church tradition says Matthew was a disciple, but the Gospels are all anonymous. And so none of them claim their authority rests in who they were or what they saw, which I think is significant, that none of them put their name on it. Because obviously it was customary to put your name on a source back in the day. And, you know, I, Paul, write to you the churches in Galatia. But you don't get that with the Gospels. And so something else was at work in the way they put that together. But Nancy was saying, how do you reconcile that, particularly with individuals who are pointing to that as compromising the authority of the text in some way, right? That doing this. And the answer is exactly right. It can't be from God. Look at the differences. And I mean, sort of broadly speaking, what you're asking in some ways, Nancy, is what my theology of Scripture is in a lot of ways. And I have always said that I have an incarnational view of Scripture. I believe that Scripture I have an incarnational view of Jesus, I have an incarnational view of the church, and I have an incarnational view of the Bible. I believe that Jesus was fully God and fully human at exactly the same time. The church is both the body of Christ and a bunch of flawed human beings trying to do the best we can. And Scripture is the Word of God and the Word of people at the same time. And so God is working within the personalities and the gifts and the understanding and the culture and the language of these people in the first century who are telling these stories. and doing it in such a way that God is the ultimate author, and yet, at the exact same time, it reveals these individuals' character and the way they tell the story. And so each of these individuals have their own agenda, their own concerns. One of the things that we'll notice when we get there, probably not tonight, because this is a great question, but this is a really good question, is that Mark says at the end of it, that the young man at the tomb says, Jesus will meet you in Galilee. And in Matthew, he's in Galilee. And in John, after the resurrection, they're fishing in the Galilee. Luke only has Jesus around Jerusalem, because that screws up what Luke is doing with the geography. Because when Luke tells the story, in Luke, they're in Jerusalem, and then in Acts, part 2, Jesus says, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. And so he's setting up this scripture that the gospel's going out from Jerusalem. And if Jesus is in the Galilee, that screws up his geography. Look, I'm trying to tell a story here, and you're messing it up. So he doesn't have any resurrection appearances in the Galilee. Well, I think Jesus appeared in the Galilee, but Luke doesn't want to tell those because, again, it doesn't fit with the story he's trying to tell. And the way in which they tell these stories, it causes us heartburn because, we want to know, well, which temptation story is the right order? Or we want to know, well, when did Jesus clean the temple? Did he cleanse the temple at the end of his ministry? Did he do it at the beginning of his ministry? But that's not the way they thought about telling history. That's not the way they taught about telling stories thought about telling stories. So my answer, and it kind of sounds like a cop-out, but it's really a deeply held theological position, and that is that if they tell stories different than the way we tell stories, that's not their problem. Right? They are reflecting their culture. As God encounters us where we are, God encountered them where they were. And that's why I have dedicated my life to try to learn as much as I could about where they were, right? And what was their culture and what was surrounding them and how would they have heard these words in such a way? Because I feel like if I can hear what Jesus is saying to them then, I can better hear what God is saying to me now. And so what we're coming up against is 2,000 years of culture that is different. And we tell stories different, and we tell history different, and it really is, as I've always said, it's culture getting in the way, and we have to be better listeners to what they were doing and what they were saying, and hear them for what they were saying. And I think it moves us away from, well, look at all the contradictions. It's not like the people who put the Bible together didn't see the differences; they just didn't get bothered by them, right? And there aren't. This is one example I always used in when I was teaching, and you may remember, I think I've used it before. But remember back when MTV showed music videos? Remember back when that was? years in the 1980s. Back in my day, yes. Before the internet came in the mail, we had music videos. And you remember in the music video, you'd have the song playing, right? And the band, some of them were crazy, right? You had Take On Me, which was sort of an iconic music video. But some of them, you'd have the band up on stage. Then all of a sudden, the band would be on a rocky cliff playing the same song. And then next thing, they're inside a church. And then they're all in wedding dresses. And then they're all back in black leather. And when you watch those videos, at no point did you say, well, they didn't have time to change clothes. This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen in my life. I mean, those are 1,000 miles apart. There's no way they had time to make it. What, could they have been a transporter now and go right from the stage and change? You weren't bothered by that at all because you know how music videos work. You know how editing works, right? And you know that those things which are obvious contradictions were all in service of the song. As long as the song wasn't messed up, you can do whatever you want in the music video. And so I think that is one place where we're willing to accept obvious contradictions in storytelling. There wasn't time for them to change clothes because we know how the song works. We know how music videos work. Well, they knew how stories worked. And they weren't bothered by the fact that Mark said this and Luke said that. They said, oh, Mark is saying this because he's trying to teach me this. Luke is saying this because he's trying to teach me this. And so I kind of think about the Gospels as sermons in many ways that they're preaching, and each of them has a different, I preach a lot of sermons on the same text. And so it depends on what's going on in the world, what's going on in the life of the church, what's going on in my life, that's the emphasis I give or the angle that comes, I feel that God gives out of that text. It's the same thing.
Is it a little bit like similar folk tales that come, you've got the Russian one, you've
Maybe.
You've got, and they're all
Yeah.
similar, but they are different. They have the same moral, maybe the moral
Maybe.
story at the end.
Yeah. She was, is it the sort of shared folktale narratives that we have around? Maybe. I wonder if it's not thinking about how the same story is told differently. Like, let's talk about the German story of Hansel and Gretel versus the Disney version, or the Danish story of A Little Mermaid versus what Disney does with Little Mermaid, or the original Cinderella and what Disney does with Cinderella. Well, the German story, the German folktales were told to children and were the way they were because we're basically trying to teach children the world is a terrible place. There are people out there that will eat you. So be careful. That's the lesson we're trying to teach. That's not what Walt Disney was trying to teach in the telling of these stories, right? And so we have same story told two different ways. Now, in that case, it's a fable, right? So we're not vesting that kind of authority that we were going to invest this in it. But it's the same. But it is the same kind of issue of what is the. I've always said every text in the Bible is occasional literature, and what I mean by that is some occasion motivated them to write it down. Nobody just sat down and went, I think I'm going to write a creation story. I've got some great ideas for a creation story. Dream with me. No, they don't do that. They have these issues that are going on. It's like, you know what? No, we need to correct these ideas on creation, and I need to tell this idea on creation. And like Luke, I heard a lot of people telling Jesus' stories, but I need to write this Jesus story because this one's orderly. And so it is what is motivating them in real time in their real lives that motivates the telling of these stories. So that's why I said it's an important question, because it really is sort of foundational to how you're reading Scripture. Because if you are trying to read with this sort of post-Enlightenment Western idea, it doesn't take long to see that they're not telling stories the way we do. Yeah, absolutely. So much so that when Thomas Jefferson gets his Thomas Jefferson Bible, we take all the miracles out, right? Because there's no way that's real, so we just take all that out. Jesus is just a teacher in the Thomas Jefferson Bible. So that's a great question. That's why I said that's a question worthy of being on camera, because it's a very good question. So I'm confident we're not getting through tonight, so that's good. Pressure's off. So anything else before we get going? We may not even get started tonight if it's another good question. So we're good. Okay, well, let us then move forward in the book of Mark, if not finishing it. The final section of the gospel shows the death and resurrection of the suffering servant. It is very much in the image of Isaiah. You might recall the suffering servant stories from Isaiah 40 through 55. We have the faithful servant to God who came and preached God's word, was misunderstood, abused, but ultimately shown to be correct and resurrected. That narrative informs all of our gospel stories. That is why it is so easy to see Jesus in the suffering servant, because the Gospels saw Jesus in the suffering servant. They're telling that story that way on purpose. I think the suffering servant narrative speaks to a lot of righteous people who are misheard and punished for speaking that way and speak prophetically in this world. And so I don't think the suffering servant is only Jesus, but I think the Gospel saw it as, yes, that is Jesus preaching in this way. So we tell that story of the suffering servant and Jesus all the way through the end, and continuing examples of no one understanding Jesus. This has also been a theme in Mark, right? No one understands him. His family doesn't get him. The disciples don't get him. The Gentiles seem to, right? The Syro-Phoenician woman seemed to get him. And the man, Gary, the Gerasene demoniac, he seemed to get him. I call him Gary just because I think that's a great name. But nobody understands him. The Gentiles are ahead of the game in this. So let's carry on. When last we left our heroes, you might recall, we had the Last Supper together, and they went out from that place. So Jesus and disciples came to a place called Gethsemane. Jesus said to them, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him. He began to feel despair and was anxious. Now, again, remember I said Mark has the lowest Christology. In other words, Jesus is the most human in all four Gospels in Mark. John has the highest Christology. This sentence would never occur in John, just so you know. He would never begin to feel despair and be anxious in John. In John, Jesus is in total control when he tells the story. And I just think that's another one of those examples. Mark is telling a different focus here when he talks about it. He said to them, "I'm very sad. It's as if I am dying. Stay here and keep alert." Then he went a short distance further and fell to the ground. He prayed that if possible, he might be spared the time of suffering. He said, Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not what I want, but what you want. So we have an anguished prayer from Jesus in the garden. Again, in John, serene prayer, whole chapter, praying for the church that they might all be one. But here, it's, can there please be another way? Can there please be another way? Because this is going to be hard. But not what I want, but what you want. So, this is the pictures that you see of Jesus praying in the garden with hands folded and gentle heaven light coming on Jesus' face as he gazes into heaven. That's the Gospel of John. That is not Mark. I've got a really good picture of a statue from the Garden of Gethsemane, from the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. And I'm looking at it right now. I should probably get it and I can show it to you. It is a wonderful depiction, life-size depiction of Jesus' prayer in the garden. Maybe I can show it on camera too. Wouldn't that be cool? The funny thing is I'm in here and the people at home can hear me perfectly well. Maybe 5 feet away. We'll see. How does that look? Did it focus?
There you go.
Yeah? Can we see it? Good. Wonderful life-size picture of a Jesus that is truly in anguish as he prays that you have to walk about a quarter of a mile back into the woods to find the statue. And I just think it's a powerful, powerful, one of my favorite depictions of it. That one's from the Gospel of Mark. Okay. Jesus praying, yes, Jesus praying serenely is not from the Gospel. There's a great story about the statues, actually. They were commissioned by the parents of Jonathan Daniels, who was an Episcopalian seminarian from Massachusetts, I believe, who went to Alabama during the Civil Rights period, was on the walk from Selma to Montgomery, was actually shot in Mississippi defending a young African-American girl as they were going down the street in Mississippi by one of the people there that was trying to enforce segregation, and is considered a martyr by many, and his face is actually depicted in the National Cathedral. He is one of the faces in the little alcove that you can find, and his parents commissioned those statues that were there.
It's a universe body, though.
It's well, you walk around in the hot Middle Eastern desert, you tone. Yeah, so anyway, it's very much a picture of anguish and wishing that something could be different. Interestingly, before you get to those statues, and I don't have this framed in my room, he came and found the disciples sleeping. He said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Couldn't you stay alert for 1 hour? Stay alert and pray so you won't give in to temptation. The spirit is eager, but the flesh is weak. About 30 feet before you get to that statue of Jesus, there are 3 giant sleeping disciples laying on the ground before you get there. So it's really quite a walk through the woods. And if you're ever in Trappist, Kentucky, which is just south of Louisville, you can ask one of the monks there, where are the statues? And you have to cross the street and walk back in the woods, but you'll find it, I'm sure. But that's right. They make good bourbon candy. Yeah, so absolutely right. Again, Jesus left them and prayed, repeating the same words. And again, when he came back, he found them sleeping, for they couldn't keep their eyes open and they didn't know how to respond to him. He came a third time and said to them, will you sleep in the rest of the night? That's enough. The time has come for the human one to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's go. Look, here comes my betrayer. Suddenly, while Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came with a mob carrying swords and clubs. They'd been sent by the chief priests, legal experts, and elders. So these are not Roman guards. These are temple guards. So that's an important feature in this, I think. This is the Jewish leadership that decided he needs to go, and they sent them out to do this. His betrayer had given them a sign, arrest the man I kiss and take him away under guard. As soon as he got there, Judas said to Jesus, Rabbi, then he kissed him. Then they came and grabbed Jesus and arrested him. Again, that's Mark's telling. They came and grabbed Jesus and arrested him. In John, he goes out to meet them, and then he's arrested. Because in John, no one takes away from Jesus. No one's forcing Jesus to do this. Jesus is doing this willingly. And so when John tells the story, he wants to remove anything that might make you think that Jesus wasn't going into this willingly, that he just lost a fight, if you will. So that John is written last, and I think John is trying to make sure that there aren't any misunderstandings that that you could get from the other gospels. Like, oh, if Jesus had just done something different, like so someone actually said, I think it was on Facebook, someone said, if Jesus had a gun, he'd still be alive today. It's like, not sure we've understood that story, but anyway, one of the bystanders drew a sword and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his ear. Jesus responded, "Have you come with swords and clubs to arrest me like an outlaw? Day after day I was with you teaching in the temple, but you didn't arrest me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." And all his disciples left him and ran away. One young man, a disciple, was wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They grabbed him, but he left the linen cloth behind and ran away naked. So a lot of things going on here. I think, don't know for sure, but I think this is when the disciples thought, now's the time to spring into action. Right? We've been quiet. We haven't done anything. But here come the guards. We're not going to let them get Jesus. Now's the chance where we start the fight. The crowds will join in. We've seen them on our side. This is when we spring into action, and Jesus shuts it down completely, shuts it down. And that's when everybody runs away. When suddenly Jesus isn't who they wanted him to be. Suddenly Jesus isn't the one who's going to foment this insurrection, who's going to get rid of the Romans, who's going to throw off this oppressive religious leadership that they've got. Jesus wasn't that, and that's when they lose hope. And that's when they run away. And that's when we get this young man wearing nothing but a linen cloth and loses that and runs away naked. If you might recall back during our Good Friday service, it was in Mark this year, and we read this passage. This was, by the way, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. This was the traditional dress post-baptism, because baptism in the early church was done naked. You had male deacons and women deacons, thankfully, and it was done usually back behind the chancel area. It was usually done Easter morning. You haven't taken communion before. They had usually the Lenten preparation time. And Easter morning before sunrise, you would go back behind the chancel, men with the men, women with the women. You would disrobe completely, taking off all your earthly vestments, if you will, and you walk into the baptismal waters naked. You are baptized, and you come out the other side, and they give you a white robe that you are clothed in, and you go and join your community, your church community now, able to fully participate in the community for the very first time. So you couldn't say this, wearing a linen cloth, naked underneath, without bringing to mind baptism for people in the early church. This would have been, they would have thought of, is baptism. And so having this white robe stripped off, this is a rejection of baptism, is what we're seeing here. So remember, Mark, we don't know exactly the occasion that Mark is written for, but it is suggested that perhaps it is written in a time after Roman persecution, when people were being pressed upon to either follow the emperor cult or be martyred. If you don't sacrifice to the emperor, then you're going to be dead. After maybe the Neronic persecution from Nero, maybe. And there was that challenge. What do you do with these people who have said, oh no, I'll worship the emperor cult, and then try to come back and rejoin the church, versus the people who were willing to give their lives before they worshiped at the emperor cult? And so this would have been a real split in that early church. And so it's been suggested for some that this is the Mark trying to deal somewhat with that issue, that here everyone turns away and rejects their baptism. Here, this young man, this unnamed young man, rejects his baptism and runs away. So there's always a lot more going on than you think when you're looking at this, and I think that's very likely the right reading of this. There are those who suggest this might have been Mark, John Mark, who wrote the text, which is a nice translation, or nice interpretation, but there's no reason to believe it's him more than it's anybody else. And I actually think it's better that we don't have the name when we see how the story ends, which won't be tonight. That's okay. Okay. Any questions there?
I think you explained why they came, like, with a lot of people
Yeah.
and a lot of weapons.
Right.
Because they
were expecting a fight.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he's got at least 12 folks that are going to be fighting for him, and clearly a lot more, because it doesn't say it was a bystander that pulled the sword, or it doesn't say it was a disciple that pulled the sword, it said it was a bystander that pulled the sword.
So there were others with
It
weapons.
seems there were people on Jesus' side there ready to go. And by the way, cutting off the ear most people suggest it was like the earlobe. So it wasn't like he was coming down. It was like he was going for the head and cut his ear off that way. So it wasn't like he hit him and he ducked out of the way and ended up like Van Gogh. I don't think that was it. It was probably the earlobe that he got because he was swinging for the neck. So, and Jesus said, no, not what we're doing. So we now get another Markan sandwich. You remember our Markan sandwiches? Where Mark starts a story, another story in between, finishes the story. We get 2 trials, one before the Sanhedrin, one before Pilate, and in between we get the trial of Peter. Peter has said last week, wasn't going to deny Jesus, go Jesus all the way to the grave, and that comes in between Jesus' 2 trials, we see. So they led Jesus away to the high priest. All the chief priests, elders, and legal experts are gathered. Peter followed him from a distance right into the high priest's courtyard. He was sitting with the guards, warming himself by the fire. The chief priests, the whole Sanhedrin, were looking for testimony against Jesus in order to put him to death, but they couldn't find any. Many brought false testimony against him, but they contradicted each other. Some stood to offer false witness against him and said, we heard him saying, I'll destroy this temple constructed by humans, and within 3 days I'll build another, one not made by humans. But their testimonies didn't even agree on this point. Then the high priest stood up in the middle of the gathering and examined Jesus. Aren't you going to respond to the testimony these people have brought against you? But Jesus was silent and didn't answer. Again the high priest asked, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus said, I am. You will see the human one sitting on the right side of the Almighty, coming on the heavenly clouds. Right side of the Almighty, Psalm 110, coming in the heavenly clouds, Daniel 7. And so we've got 2 explicit Davidic messianic scriptures Jesus is referencing in just that one answer. So he is claiming to be Messiah. He also said, I am, when he asked if he was the Messiah. So we got I am, and then we've got these other 2 references that they would have heard immediately, sitting at the right hand of the Father, coming in the clouds. They would have not missed that. And that's why the high priest gets upset. The high priest tore his clothes and said, why do we need any more witnesses? Suggestion has been that this was when the judgment is rendered, that the high priest would tear his cloak to signify the judgment had happened. And so he's done now. We don't need any more witnesses. The trial's over. You're guilty, I think is what the high priest is saying. Then he says, you've heard this insult against God. What do you think? So now he's asking for the decision, but it seems he's already made his decision. They all condemned him. He deserves to die. Some began to spit on him. Some covered his face and hit him, saying, prophesy. Then the guards took him and beat him. Meanwhile, Peter was below in the courtyard. A woman, one of the high priest's servants, approached, saw Peter warming himself by the fire. She stared at him and said, you are also with the Nazarene Jesus. But he denied it, saying, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand what you're saying. He went outside in the outer courtyard, and a rooster crowed. The female servant saw him and began a second time to say to those standing around, this man is one of them. But he denied it again. A short time later, those standing around again said to Peter, you must be one of them because you're also a Galilean. But he cursed and swore, I don't know this man you're talking about. At that very moment, a rooster crowed a second time. Peter remembered what Jesus told him. Before a rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down sobbing. So he was with him for a little bit, but the crowd was too much. At daybreak, the chief priests with the elders, legal experts, and the whole Sanhedrin formed a plan. They bound Jesus, led him away, and turned him over to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, are you the king of the Jews? Which is really what he's after. Because he doesn't care, he's the Christ or not. What does that matter to Pilate, whether or not Jews consider you the Messiah? That's no big deal. But if you're fomenting some sort of political rebellion, then yeah, we've got a problem here. The Romans are interested in that. So are you the king of the Jews? Jesus replied, that's what you say. Chief priests were accusing him of many things. Pilate asked him again, aren't you going to answer? What about all these accusations? But Jesus gave no more answers, so that Pilate marveled. He doesn't even engage the trolls here. He just doesn't say anything while they're making all of these accusations. So during the festival, Pilate released one prisoner to them, whomever they requested. A man named Barabbas was locked up with rebels who had committed murder during an uprising. So you get the sense here, political, zealot, trying to inspire Jewish rebellion here, exactly what everybody was, I think, wanting Jesus to try and do just a few moments ago back in the garden. Barabbas is that in this. The crowd pushed forward and asked Pilate to release someone as he regularly did. Pilate answered, do you want me to release you the king of the Jews? He knew the chief priest had handed him over because of jealousy. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas to them instead. Pilate replied, then what do you want me to do with one you call king of the Jews? They shouted back, crucify him. And Pilate said, why? What has he done wrong? And they shouted even louder, "Crucify him." Pilate wanted to satisfy the crowd, so he released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus whipped, then handed over to be crucified. So he really thought the crowd would be against the leadership because they were jealous of Jesus' popularity. But now that Jesus is in the custody of the people that the Messiah is supposed to come and get rid of, well, he's obviously not the Messiah, right? He got captured just like Barabbas did, just like all these other false messiahs that come and go. So, first round quarterback doesn't do all the first round quarterback's supposed to do, and the whole crowd turns on him. They were cheering for him on draft day. The minute he gets sacked, then that's it. No, the crowd's against him. Same idea, right? You lose the crowd completely when you see him losing to the people he's supposed to come and beat. 100%. So how are we doing? I get excited and start rolling, and I don't stop and ask for questions, so get wound up. We might finish. Just going to keep rolling. The soldiers led Jesus away into the courtyard of the palace known as the governor's headquarters. This would be that northern palace that I was talking about on Sunday that Herod the Great developed, the Antiochia fortress on the north end of the Temple Mount. So it's right beside the temple. It's right up there. And they called together the whole company of soldiers. They dressed him up in a purple robe, twisted together a crown of thorns, and put on him. They saluted him, "Hey, King of the Jews." Again and again, they struck his head with a stick. They spit on him and knelt before him to honor him. When they finished mocking him, they stripped him of the purple robe, put his own clothes back on him, and led him out to crucify him. Simon, a man from Cyrene, Alexander and Rufus's father. I love this. You remember Cyrene, the man of Cyrene? He's Alexander and Rufus's father. It tells us this like with that kind of detail. There's so many Cyrenes named Simon. I just couldn't keep them. But Alexander and Rufus, they were great. Loved them, those kids. Anyway, he was coming in from the countryside, and they forced him to carry his cross. I love it when the Bible does that, like we're going to know who they are. Some people suggest, by the way, that anytime the Bible does have names like this, it's because they became prominent later in the church, that they likely were followers later on in history, and so they're telling it's a cameo appearance. And so like the reason that we don't get the rich young ruler's name is because he goes away sad, but the reason we get Bartimaeus' name is because he gets healed. And so, you always want to know the cameos there. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the skull place, yes. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't take it. They crucified him, divided up his clothes, drawing lots for them to determine who would take what. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The notice of formal charge against him was written, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 outlaws with him, one on his right and the other on his left. People walking by insulted him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ha, so you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, were you? Save yourself and come down from the cross." So you notice people walking by are tempting him or taunting him because crucifixion's usually done low to the ground right by the roads because it's publicly humiliating. Yes?
When they mention the time of day,
Yes.
they're saying that's when he was
That's when
nailed to the
they
cross.
put him on the cross, yeah.
And then another gospel is 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
That's when it's over, yeah. I spent 6 hours on the cross. Yeah. Yeah. Crucifixion, easily the most cruel way that we've come up with to kill someone, I think, in history. Because it is agony over time and days, basically. Because usually,
Jesus was beaten so much.
because he was already so weak, he's already bleeding, there was the trauma of all of that. I mean, Pilate can't believe he's already dead because they were really good at making sure that you stayed alive in agony for as long as possible. And people saw how agony it was so that they wouldn't do whatever it is that put you on that. I mean, the whole thing was meant as a deterrent, to be as cruel as humanly possible to deter you from doing whatever put these people up on the cross. Yeah, it was done in full view of everyone, on the roads, so that people would see it. Basically you drowned over time because you can't stretch your diaphragm. The liquid builds up in your lungs. And the only way to get a breath is to push up on a leg to get a breath, and then you collapse again. So, yeah, it's as cruel as you can be. The Assyrians might be worse. They did impale people, and you'd bleed out over time, but that was over hours. This is days of agony, usually, depending on what kind of shape a person was in. And if Jesus was ripped like the statue, then, it could take forever. In the same way, the chief priests were making fun of him among themselves, together with the legal experts. He saved others, but he can't save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross. Then we'll see and believe. Even those who'd been crucified with Jesus insulted him. So both thieves are mean in Mark. We don't have a good thief. In Luke, we get a good thief, but not in Mark. In Mark, both thieves are angry. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, the whole earth was dark. At 3, Jesus cried with a loud shout, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Quoting Psalm 22. After hearing him, some standing there said, look, he's calling Elijah. His last words are misunderstood. Jesus has been misunderstood through this whole gospel, and at the end, in anguish, he cries out, and they missed that too.
In Aramaic.
In Aramaic, that's correct. In
We
Aramaic.
don't get many quotes of Jesus speaking Aramaic.
We don't. We got Tabitha Kum, where rise up, little girl. We get the blind man. I think he talks in Aramaic at one point, and so we had 2 miracles when that happened, and then we get this one. Yeah. 3 times in Mark we get the Aramaic. In Matthew he speaks Hebrew. He says Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. But here in Mark he speaks Aramaic. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Which Aramaic and Hebrew are like Spanish and Portuguese, just really, really, really close. So, if you give me enough time, I can translate Aramaic, but it takes me a minute. But Hebrew I'm good at. Aramaic is like, the same thing. If you ask someone speaks Spanish to read Portuguese, they can usually do it. Give them a second, but they can do it. It's a challenge. But gets misunderstood at the end. Someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a pole, offered it to Jesus to drink, saying, let's see if Elijah will come to take him down. But Jesus let out a loud cry and died. This is one of the coolest things ever. I love, this is a mark, no, not this part, stay with me. This the way the story is told is one of the coolest things ever. I'm sorry, Jesus dying is not a cool thing. But this is the way we tell the story here, because we get another Markan sandwich. And this one, it's completely changed my life when I heard a guy do this at a national meeting. He said, so we get Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus lets out a loud cry and dies. At the moment Jesus dies, the curtain of the sanctuary was torn in 2 from top to bottom. So right after Jesus cries out, the temple veil is ripped from top to bottom. Not bottom to top so people can get in, but top to bottom, God has come out of the temple. So Jesus says, why have you abandoned me? And God responds by rushing out of the temple in that moment. And when this happens, when the centurion who stood facing Jesus saw how he died, he said, this man was certainly God's son. So this great moment of, my God, why have you forsaken me? God answers by ripping out of the temple, and the centurion says, this man was God's son. The image being that when he sees God's response to Jesus' cry of dereliction, this guy's got to be God's son. It's just, so the only human being who explicitly says that Jesus is the Son of God, a fact that we have known since verse 1 of this gospel, is the Roman centurion. He gets it. From the Holy of Holies. Yeah, sectioning off the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. Yeah. And it doesn't matter that you wouldn't be able to see the temple curtain from where the centurion was. That's not important to the story. This is the story we're telling here. So, some women who were watching from a distance, including Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, the younger one, Joseph, and Salome. And when Jesus was in Galilee, these women had followed and supported him along with many other women who had come to Jerusalem with him. They actually financially contributed to Jesus' ministry, these women. I just like to take a moment to say that. Since it was late in the afternoon on the preparation day, just before the Sabbath, Joseph from Arimathea dared to approach Pilate and ask for Jesus' body. Joseph was a prominent council member who also eagerly anticipated the coming of God's kingdom. Pilate wondered if Jesus was already dead. It's only been 6 hours. How could Jesus, normally crucifixion takes a lot more time than that. Pilate wondered if Jesus was already dead. He called the centurion and asked him whether Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that Jesus was dead, Pilate gave the dead body to Joseph. He bought a linen cloth, took Jesus down from the cross, wrapped him in the cloth, laid him in a tomb that had been carved out of rock, rolled a stone against the entrance to the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where he was buried. So, this rich man touching a dead body, pretty well meaning he's not going to celebrate Passover, the most important holiday of the entire year for everybody. And he's given up that opportunity because now he's unclean, because he's handling, this prominent council member is handling a dead body. I think we don't give him enough credit for what he is sacrificing. I mean, what would it take for you to give up Christmas, right? That's what we're asking here. This man did something that took him away, this prominent, think of me, right? I'm the pastor of the church, right? I've got responsibilities Christmas Eve, okay? I have leadership roles, I'm planning on preaching. What would happen that I would do something that would take me out of that role or responsibility, that I would give up that night to go and speak. I mean, that's the kind of event, that's the kind of faith he's showing here. And he's not going to be able to celebrate the holiday now as a result of it. So, big deal. I do love when the women see where the men put Jesus and how they buried him, they decided to go and fix the problem. So, when Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so they could go and anoint Jesus' dead body. Because clearly Joseph, he meant well, but if you want the job done right, you got to do it yourself. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they came to the tomb. They were saying to each other, who's going to roll the stone away from the entrance for us? When they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away. And it was a very large stone. Going into the tomb, they saw a young man in a white robe. They saw a young man in a white robe. They had a young man who just gave up his white robe. The young man's got his white robe back. So it's a restoration. This resurrection of Christ has brought him back into the fellowship. His baptism is back. Seated on the right side, and they were startled. But he said to them, don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He's been raised. He isn't here. Look at the place where they laid him. Go tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he's going ahead of you into Galilee. You'll see him there just as he told you. Overcome with terror and dread, they fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. It's a lousy way to end the gospel. But I do have one question, because this translation already made a decision for you, and I wonder what you think. Because literally it says, go tell his disciples and Peter. And there are two ways to read that. Go tell his disciples and Peter could mean go tell his disciples and especially Peter, or go tell his disciples and Peter who denied Jesus and is therefore no longer a disciple. So clearly, our translators of the Common English Bible think we're calling Peter out especially, right? Tell his disciples, make sure and tell Peter. He's going to need it more than anybody, so tell Peter. But the text leaves open which way to read that, of whether he's in or not.
Well, to name Peter specifically,
Yes,
implies to me you're going to need to make sure you find Peter. The rest of them are going to be together.
right, okay. Okay.
So you're going to find them all together. You can tell them, but
So-
make sure you also separately find Peter and tell
So
Peter.
less a statement of where Peter's faith is and more the practical concern of Peter himself will not identify himself with the disciples
Or
and will probably be
The
separate.
last we heard, he was sobbing.
Right.
He probably was punishing himself, saying, I'm not worthy of this group anymore.
Right?
That's
I mean, we psychologically...
pretty far.
No, I think those are our options here, right? It either is make sure you tell Peter, or tell the disciples and tell Peter, even though he's not a disciple anymore. The translators here go with make sure you're telling Peter, because he's going to, for the reasons I think you bring up, he needs to know that Jesus is back.
The young man in the tomb.
Yes.
Was that ever, I don't know, I thought somebody once said that was an angel.
In Matthew, they're angels. In fact, in Matthew, there's two of them, and they're angels. In Mark, it's a young man. Yeah. So, yes, which is great.
I also am curious about the Greek for the phrase, he's been raised.
Yes. It's a deponent verb, middle voice in this context. Third person, passive. He was raised. He's been resurrected. God raised him.
Okay.
Yeah. So
He's not dead anymore.
he's not dead anymore. Why are you searching for the living among the dead? Yeah, he's not here. That's Matthew. That's not here. So the earliest and most reliable manuscripts in the gospel at verse 8. This is the last verse. The women were terrified and didn't tell anybody anything. The Greek, this section, Mark 16, 9 through 20, there is no section, frankly, of the Bible that has more textual variance in it than these 11 verses. The Greek in this section doesn't look like the Greek of the rest of Mark. And as I say, the two most reliable text families do not have anything after verse 8. Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are two of the most reliable, earliest, complete Greek manuscripts we have, and it ends there. Some manuscripts have comments that say that earlier manuscripts don't have anything after verse 8. So they might copy 9 to 20, but they say, originally these things weren't here. So apparently, around the 4th century, some pious Christian scribe decided that the women were terrified and didn't tell anybody anything was a lousy way to end a gospel. Because, gosh, in Matthew you can see Jesus talking to folks, and in Luke you can see Jesus talking to folks, and in John you can see Jesus talking to folks, and in Acts you can see Jesus talking to folks, and you can't just say, and the women were terrified and didn't tell him anything, because that's a terrible way to end a gospel. when we know more happened? And so there are two possibilities, well, three possibilities. One, it ended at 16:8. Mark said that's the end of the gospel. It's possible Mark had an ending that was lost, or it's possible the longer ending is authentic. I do not believe the longer ending is authentic at all. I think the gospel ended at 16:8. I think it is a brilliant way to draw the reader in. Everybody has misunderstood from the beginning of the gospel. Why not have the women misunderstand at the very end as well? Fear is a theme in Mark. Fear leads to faith. Fear leads to rejection. What is going to happen to the women? I really think it draws you in. They were terrified and didn't tell anybody anything. What do you do with the story of the resurrected Jesus? I mean, it really does draw the reader in to decide. Now, you have heard these stories that Jesus is raised, but the women didn't tell anybody anything. What are you going to do?
Well, when did the women go and tell the disciples?
Matthew and John. I mean, it's Mary and John who does it, and Luke. Yeah. So cliffhangers are not foreign in the Bible. There are a lot of cliffhangers in the Bible. Acts ends without telling us what happens to Paul. Prodigal son's brother, we don't know what happens. Jonah, we don't know what happens. Malachi. I mean, we've got Genesis. We've got all sorts of cliffhangers in the Bible. It's not an unusual thing. So there are a couple of endings. There's the shorter, longer ending of Mark. So the shorter, longer ending is, they promptly reported all the young man's instructions to those who were with Peter. Afterwards, through the work of the disciples, Jesus sent out from the east to the west a sacred and undying message of eternal salvation. Amen. That's it. So there are those verses. That's the shorter, longer ending. Okay. The longer ending looks like this. After Jesus rose up on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons, which sounds an awful lot like John chapter 20. She went and reported to the ones who'd been with him, who were mourning and weeping. But even after they heard the news, they didn't believe that Jesus was alive and that Mary had seen him. That's definitely John 20. And after that, he appeared in a different form, 2 of them who were walking along in the countryside. Well, doggone it, that's the road to Emmaus in Luke chapter 24. When they returned, they reported to the others, but they didn't believe them. Finally, he appeared to the 11 while they were eating. Jesus criticized their unbelief and stubbornness because they didn't believe those who saw him after he was raised up. He said to them, go into the whole, that part sounds like John. This part, go into the whole world and proclaim the good news to every creature. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever doesn't believe will be condemned. Sounds a little bit like Matthew 28. These signs will be associated with those who believe. They'll throw out demons in my name. They'll speak in new languages. That sounds like Acts chapter 2. They'll pick up snakes with their hands. If they drink anything poisonous, it will not hurt them. Well, that sounds a little, the snake biting thing is a story of Paul in the book of Acts. They'll place their hands on the sick and they'll get well. After the Lord Jesus spoke to them, he was lifted up into heaven. Well, that is Acts chapter 1. And sat down at the right side of God. But they went out and proclaimed the message everywhere. The Lord worked with them, confirming the word by the signs associated with them. So I tried to go as we went along, but there's a whole lot of places that I think our scribe was drawing from the resurrection appearances of Jesus to try and fix Mark and make it a better ending, which I don't think you have to, but he obviously was troubled by it, so we'll give him a break on that. Yeah. By the way, the only major, he puts in quotes, theological issue that stands or falls on a text variant reading comes from the longer ending of Mark, and it is picking up snakes and not being hurt. The snake-handling churches that use snakes in worship get that from the King James translation of Mark 16, 9 through 20, which the King James just hasn't included because it just had the majority manuscripts. They didn't look at which manuscripts were better or worse. So if you know about your snake-handling churches, there was one about 20 miles from where we lived in Kingston, Georgia. My family's from Eastern Kentucky. There's a whole lot of them in that area. West Texas has snake-handling churches. It's true. I've told it before. There was one snake handling pastor that tormented my aunt with it, because actually it was not the snake handling pastor. It was my Uncle Carl who told my Aunt Jessie he needed to see what was in the back of this pastor's truck, and he had snakes in the back of the pastor's truck, and then that terrified my aunt. She jumped and let out an expletive, and the pastor says, "Sister, you ain't getting into heaven if you ain't got no more faith than that." Yeah, that's where that comes from, is that. I don't have to say a whole lot more about that. I don't necessarily find that as an expression of faith, but there are those who do, and they usually have pictures at the back of the church of those whose faith was not quite strong enough. They got bit and did not survive. So how do we sum up? How about that? How do we sum up? Mark is brief it is action-packed. It is very simple in the way it talks about things. All of our stories are connected with "and." A lot of graphic detail, green grass, angry, hungry. I mean, very human Jesus. A lot of things happening. Straight away, immediately, right away. That happens 41 times. Things are happening in Mark all the way through. And a lot of emphasis on actions. We got 18 miracles and 4 parables. Jesus isn't talking about a whole lot in Mark. He is doing in this gospel. A lot of doing as you go through this. So, I do believe that Mark is probably our first gospel written. And I say that because if I have Mark, I understand why people felt they needed Matthew and Luke. If I have Matthew and Luke, I don't understand why we need Mark. So for me, it's an Occam's razor thing. That to me is the simplest explanation. If Mark is the only gospel you have, but what about the Sermon on the Mount? But what about the prodigal son? What about resurrection appearances? What about, I mean, there's more to say. What about infancy stories? What about, Bethlehem and the wise men? I mean, I get why you need Matthew and Luke if you only have Mark. So that's one of the reasons I think Mark is an early gospel as we go through this. Yeah. So I didn't think we'd do that, but we did. Amazing. Questions, comments?
Well, just the ending of the story.
Yes.
If we discard
At 8,
those
yes.
later,
And the women were terrified and didn't tell anybody anything.
so it says the tomb was empty,
Yes.
and the young man told him
He's
raised.
been raised. He'll meet you in Galilee. So
But then there's no verification that
No.
that happened.
no.
So it just seems to me that they wanted to finish telling the story, add
Yes.
more credibility to it.
Sure.
Like, it wasn't just that the tomb was empty, like the risen Christ
Yes.
encountered.
Well, I think Mark called them to a belief in believing without evidence, right? Believing
Yeah.
the testimony. And some scribe in the 4th century said, no, we better tell stories that makes them believe better. Makes it easier to believe. 'Cause- sorry. Yeah,
But
Meg?
I was going to say, tell me about the word raised.
About the word raised?
Yeah.
It is a word, I mean, that calls to mind resurrection. It's not a he was passed out and came to kind of idea. I mean, there are those who believe that, this sort of soul sleeper, I mean, that this idea of that he just passed out and the Romans were fooled. And the Romans were professionals. I mean, I honestly think that it takes more faith to believe the Romans were fooled into thinking Jesus was dead than it does to believe Jesus was resurrected, because they were just professionals. I mean, they didn't make that kind of mistake. And Pilate even asked them to double check. The word is calling to mind from the dead. Yeah, it's the same thing that you get. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, it is an act of faith. And I think that's what Mark is calling them to. Everybody's misunderstood Jesus. The Gentiles got it, but everybody else has misunderstood Jesus. What are you going to do? Right? You going to trust Jesus enough to go to Galilee? That's really the question. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. We will move on in the story. I'll figure out what we'll do in December, because we just got a few weeks in December. I don't want to do necessarily a whole new book, so we'll figure something fun out and talk together. So have a great week. I'll see you in 3 weeks, because in 2 weeks is today. Next week is Thanksgiving, no Wednesday night Bible study. So in 3 weeks,